What if the longest nights of your life, the ones where you lay completely still and stared at darkness and wondered if anyone in the world would notice if you simply stopped existing inside your own story? What if those nights were not destroying you, but secretly, invisibly, magnificently building you into something so specific and so powerful that the love you actually deserve would have no choice but to eventually find you? What if every single hour of silence you endured was teaching your heart the difference between warmth that is real and warmth that is merely comfortable? What if the woman who survives her own quiet, who puts on a red dress alone in an empty room and looks herself in the eyes and chooses, for the first time in too long, to believe what she sees? What if that woman becomes exactly the kind of person who can receive extraordinary love without shrinking from it? This is Amara's story. She endured nights that would have broken anyone who did not already understand, somewhere deep and inarticulate, that she was built for something better. And what she found on the other side of all that silence will make you believe, truly believe, that your own quiet nights are not the end of your story. They are the beginning of the most important chapter. Stay with me, because this story belongs to every woman who has ever loved more than she was loved back. And it does not end the way you think. The bedroom was dark by 9. Not because either of them was particularly tired, but because darkness had become the most comfortable agreement they had reached in months. Amara pulled the duvet up to her chin and stared at the ceiling she had memorized completely. Every small imperfection, every shadow that shifted when car headlights swept through the curtains from the street below. She knew that ceiling better than she knew herself anymore. She used to know herself very well. There was a time she could still touch it if she tried, like pressing a thumb against an old scar, when she had been remarkably present in her own life. She had filled rooms, not with volume necessarily, but with a kind of radiant aliveness that people noticed and gravitated toward. She had opinions about art, about music, about the exact correct way to eat a mango. She had laughed at inappropriate moments and apologized for it while still laughing. She had worn the red dress at every possible opportunity because it made her feel like a magnificent, necessary interruption to ordinary life. The red dress now lived at the very back of the wardrobe. She could not remember exactly when it had retreated there. These things never happened with clean timestamps. No single morning when she woke up and said, "Today I will begin disappearing." It was gradual, the way water shapes stone. Imperceptible until suddenly you look and the whole landscape has changed, and you cannot trace exactly when the erosion began. Amara turned onto her side and looked at the window instead of the ceiling. Outside, a neighbor's light was still on, a warm, amber rectangle in the darkness. Someone over there was still awake, she thought. Someone over there was perhaps reading, or cooking something late, or talking to someone they loved on the phone. The amber light looked unbearably warm from where she lay. She reached for her phone, checked it, put it down. 17 seconds later, picked it up again and checked it once more, as though something urgent might have arrived in that thin slice of time. Nothing had arrived. Nothing ever arrived at this hour except the quiet, persistent company of her own thoughts. She remembered, and she hated herself a little for remembering, because remembering was a form of hope, and hope was a form of vulnerability. She remembered the early days when nights had been her favorite time, when darkness had felt like privacy rather than isolation, when the hours between midnight and morning had belonged entirely to them, conversations that wandered everywhere, laughter muffled into pillows, a warmth so specific and particular that she had believed, genuinely believed, it was manufactured exclusively for her. Now the nights were simply long. She had tried in the beginning to address it directly. She was not a woman who feared difficult conversations, or at least she had not been, before the silence taught her to doubt her own perceptions. She had chosen moments carefully, had approached the subject gently, had framed everything in the language of connection rather than accusation. "I feel like we've been distant lately." The the response had been a kind of elaborate nothing, a performance of acknowledgement that contained no actual recognition. Yes, work was stressful. Yes, things had been busy. Yes, of course everything was fine. And somehow she had been left feeling both dismissed and confused, as though she had imagined the whole careful distance, as though the silence was an invention of her anxious, overly sensitive mind. She had started to believe that. This was perhaps the most insidious part. She had genuinely started to believe that the problem was her perception rather than her reality. Her friend Diane had said something once, over coffee, with the particular bluntness that made her both infuriating and essential. Amara, when someone makes you feel crazy for noticing that something is wrong, that is itself the problem. Amara had nodded and changed the subject because she was not ready to hold that truth steadily. She was better at holding other people's truths than her own. The clock on the nightstand read 11:47. She calculated, automatically, how many hours of sleep she might get if she fell asleep immediately, which she would not, because her body had forgotten how to surrender to rest easily. Sleep had become something she negotiated with, rather than simply experienced. She would lie in careful stillness, breathing slowly and deliberately, attempting to trick her own nervous system into relaxation. Sometimes it worked. Often it did not. Often she would lie there for 2, 3, sometimes 4 hours in the velvet dark, thinking thoughts she spent the daylight hours carefully avoiding. She thought about the version of herself that had existed before all this careful endurance. She tried to measure the distance between that woman and this one, lying here in practiced stillness, expert in the geography of a ceiling, fluent in a language of silence she had never wanted to learn. The distance seemed enormous. And yet she was still here, still choosing this bed, this room, this particular quality of darkness every single night, still hoping, in the stubbornest, most embarrassing corner of her heart, that something would shift, that she would turn over one morning and recognize the warmth she remembered, that the silence would break not with confrontation, but simply with a look, one honest, seeing look that would confirm she had not imagined everything. Hope was extraordinary in its refusal to listen to evidence. She had discussed it with herself many times in the language of pure logic. She was an intelligent woman. She understood, intellectually, that a relationship existing primarily on nostalgia and wishful thinking was not a relationship sustaining itself. It was a relationship being kept on life support by one person's determined refusal to accept its true condition. She understood this completely. Understanding and acting are, however, entirely separate countries. It was on a Thursday, an unremarkable, undramatic Thursday, that everything changed. Not because of a conversation or a confrontation or any of the significant events she had vaguely imagined would eventually bring some kind of resolution. It happened because of a song. She was in the kitchen in the early evening, doing nothing in particular, standing at the counter with a cup of tea going cold, staring at a point slightly beyond the window, when something played from the small speaker on the shelf. She had set it on shuffle weeks ago and largely forgotten about it. But this particular song arrived now with its specific melody, and something in her chest simply broke open. Not with grief, exactly. With recognition. She recognized herself. The woman in the song, whoever had written it, whoever had felt whatever precise ache had produced those lyrics, that woman was her, had been her. For how many months now? She had lost accurate count. But suddenly, standing in her own kitchen with cold tea and the evening going blue outside the window, she saw herself clearly for the first time in a very long time. She saw a woman who had been so busy maintaining silence that she had forgotten her own sound. She set down the cup very carefully. She walked to the bedroom wardrobe. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she reached to the very back, past orderly rows of sensible, quiet colors, and she pulled out the red dress. She held it for a moment, examining it as though reacquainting herself with evidence of a former self. Then, In the empty bedroom with no audience whatsoever, she put it on. She looked at herself in the mirror, and for one long, fierce, complicated moment, she simply looked. She made herself really look, not critically, not with the particular cruelty she had been practicing on herself lately, but with something approaching the gentleness she freely extended to everyone around her and had been systematically withholding from herself. The woman in the mirror looked back. She was still there. Underneath all the silence, all the careful management, all the practiced endurance, she was still entirely there, present, whole, vivid, alive, and wearing a red dress in an empty bedroom at 6:40 in the evening, with cold tea in the kitchen, and something irreversibly shifting inside her chest. "You deserve more than this," something said. It did not say it cruelly. It said it with tremendous kindness, the way you would speak to someone you loved who had been asleep too long. "You deserve more than this." She had heard those words before, in various forms, from Diane and from her mother, and from the small, stubborn internal voice she had spent months attempting to quiet. But this time she heard them differently. This time they did not arrive as accusation, or as invitation to conflict, or as evidence of her failure. They arrived as simple, verifiable fact. She was a woman who deserved to be loved in a way that she could actually feel. She was a woman whose presence in a room should be noticed by the person who had chosen to share their life with her. She was a woman who should not have to negotiate for basic warmth, or perform adequacy, or lie awake in elaborate stillness, hoping for something that had apparently already departed. She was a woman who should not spend her nights enduring silence, as though silence were a reasonable substitute for love. The recognition was quiet. No dramatic tears, no collapsing, no operatic moment of crisis. Just a woman in a red dress standing before her own reflection and finally choosing to believe what she saw. The weeks that followed were strange and uncomfortable in ways she had not fully anticipated. Because choosing yourself, she discovered, is not a single decision, but a continuous, daily, sometimes exhausting practice. There were mornings when the old habits of self-doubt returned, wearing the familiar faces of patience and reasonableness. There were evenings when she second-guessed herself with tremendous creative energy. There were nights, still long, still dark, still silent, when she wondered if she had been too hasty, too harsh, too demanding of something that perhaps did not exist. But she had worn the red dress, and somehow that specific act, that private, witnessed by nobody declaration, had rearranged something fundamental in her understanding of herself. She had remembered her own sound. Having remembered it, she found she could not convincingly pretend to be silent again. She called Diane. She called her mother. She started going to the small cafe around the corner on Saturday mornings, ordering the complicated coffee drink she had always wanted to try, but had somehow convinced herself was unnecessarily indulgent. She sat alone at the table by the window and read, or watched the street, or simply drank her complicated coffee in companionable peace with her own presence. She was learning, slowly and with considerable effort, to be a good companion to herself. To stop treating her own company as consolation prize and start treating it as primary experience. She was learning that a woman who knows how to genuinely enjoy her own presence is not a lonely woman. She is a free one. She started humming in the kitchen again, small things, but each small thing was a reclamation. It was on a Saturday morning in the cafe, about 6 weeks after the red dress evening, that she met someone who simply looked at her. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic fanfare. He was sitting at the table near the door, reading something with serious concentration, and he glanced up when she came in because the door was heavy, and she struggled with it briefly, and laughed at herself for struggling, which caught his attention. He smiled. She smiled back, already moving toward the counter. She ordered her complicated coffee. She found her usual table. She opened her book. She was not thinking about him, but when she looked up 20 minutes later, he was looking at her, not in an intrusive way, but in the particular way of someone who has noticed something interesting and is not yet certain what to do about the noticing. When her eyes met his, he did not look away with the guilty speed of someone caught staring. He simply nodded slightly, acknowledging the look, and returned to his book. She returned to hers. This happened 3 more times over the next 40 minutes. Each time, look, acknowledgement, return. A conversation conducted entirely in glances, comfortable and unhurried, and somehow remarkably honest. When she finally gathered her things to leave, he said simply, without performance, "I hope your book was as good as mine was." She told him it was better. He laughed. She walked out into the Saturday morning feeling something she had almost forgotten the texture of, the particular lightness of being seen by someone who looked at you as though you were entirely worth looking at. She did not run back in. She did not manufacture a reason to return. She simply walked home through the autumn morning, red leaves on the pavement, cold, good air, and something very quiet singing somewhere inside her chest. Not because of him. She did not know him, could not know him yet, might never see him again, but because she had been present enough to receive the moment, because she had worn herself back into visibility gradually and with great effort over these recent weeks. And visibility meant that moments like this could find her. She was findable again. She saw him the following Saturday, and the one after that. His name was Gabriel. He was a structural engineer who read poetry on weekends because, he explained with a slight self-consciousness she found immediately charming. He spent his working days thinking about what holds things up, and liked to spend his free hours thinking about what holds people together, which he believed poetry understood better than engineering. She told him about the red dress. Not everything, not at once. She was learning to offer herself in careful, considered portions, rather than all at once as she used to, before silence had taught her the value of her own story. But she told him enough. She told him about the nights, about the ceiling she had memorized, about the song in the kitchen on a Thursday that had broken something open rather than simply breaking it. He listened in the way she had not realized she was starving for, without waiting for his own turn to speak, without preparing his response while she was still mid-sentence, without any of the slight impatience she had learned to read in the eyes of someone whose mind had already moved on while you were still finding your words. He simply listened, as though what she was saying mattered specifically and particularly, not generally or out of courtesy, but because she mattered, this specific person, this specific story, these specific words. She felt herself expand slightly, the way a plant leans toward light without choosing to, simply following its most fundamental nature. "Is it strange?" she asked him once, over coffee that had gone slightly cold because they kept forgetting to drink it. "That I feel more known by you after 4 Saturdays than I had felt by anyone in years." He considered this seriously, which was one of his qualities she was developing a deep appreciation for. His refusal to give quick, comfortable answers when the question deserved genuine thought. "No," he said finally. "I think it makes complete sense. You've been very still for a long time. Still things are easy to overlook. You've started moving again." She thought about this for a long time afterward. She thought about it while walking home through the darkening afternoon, leaves scattering across the pavement, the city settling into its Saturday evening. She thought about how accurately he had seen it, the stillness, the moving, the difference between the two. She thought about how many Saturday mornings it had taken her to arrive at this one. How many silent nights had been, apparently, not simply punishment, but preparation. She had needed to survive her own silence, to learn what she was actually capable of enduring. And in enduring it, she had discovered she was made of something considerably stronger and more remarkable than she had previously believed. She was standing in her bedroom, getting ready to go out. A real evening, a restaurant, her first genuine date in what felt like another lifetime, when she caught herself in the mirror. She was wearing the red dress. Of course she was wearing the red dress. She looked at herself for a moment. The woman looking back was familiar, and also new. Familiar because she was still entirely herself. New because she was more entirely herself than she had been in longer than she could accurately measure. There was something restored about her face, something present in her eyes that had been conspicuously absent during those long, ceiling memorizing nights. She thought about the silence. She let herself think about it directly, without flinching, which was itself a kind of new capability. All those nights, all those hours of careful stillness, all those tears into pillows and cold cups of tea and amber lights in neighbors' windows, and the heavy, patient endurance of days that seemed designed to convince her she was less than she was. She did not feel grateful for any of it exactly. Gratitude seemed like the wrong word for something so difficult and so costly. But she understood now what she had not understood while she was inside it, that surviving your own silence requires you to develop a relationship with yourself that is more honest and more sustaining than any external relationship can be. She had been forced, night after patient night, into the only company she could not escape, her own. And in that company, somewhere in those dark hours, she had found something she had not expected to find, herself, waiting, patient as water, stubborn as stone, worth finding. She picked up her bag, she checked her lipstick. She walked to the door with the particular confidence of a woman who has endured her own depths and come back from them carrying something genuine and hard-won. Outside, the evening was clear and cold and full of stars. She looked up for a moment before she started walking. The stars were doing what stars do, existing with remarkable indifference to whether anyone was watching, burning with complete commitment regardless of witnesses, absolutely certain of their own light. She smiled at that. Then she walked into the night, her night, wearing red, carrying her own story like something precious rather than something shameful. Behind her, the apartment was quiet. For the first time in a very long time, the silence did not belong to her. This is the story of every woman who has ever lain awake in the dark, counting the distance between who she was and who she has become, wondering if the warmth she remembers was real or simply a mercy of memory. It is the story of silence, not as surrender, but as a crucible. Because Amara's journey reveals a truth both devastating and extraordinary. The nights we barely survive are often the nights that most completely shape us. She did not emerge from those silent hours unchanged. She emerged transformed, cleaner, truer, more certain of her own worth than any comfortable, unexamined life would have made her. The silence that was meant to diminish her instead stripped away everything that was not essential, leaving behind only what was most real and most resilient. She found her sound again, because she had first been forced to sit inside the silence long enough to remember what her own voice felt like. Real love, present, consistent, witnessing love, found her not despite her long endurance, but because of it. Because she had done the extraordinary private work of becoming someone who would recognize genuine love and receive it without flinching. Night after night, she endured the silence. And night after night, without knowing it, she was becoming exactly who she needed to be.